New tonight, investigators following leads to find out if the brutal killing is connected to something even more dangerous.
Just a few days before Christmas, on December 21st, 2017, Paul Anderson, president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club's Pasco County chapter, was ambushed and killed in Florida by two masked men in broad daylight. Anderson was pronounced dead at the scene, but the rival gang had no idea that killing the Outlaws president would cost them everything. The shooters were members of the 69ers Motorcycle Club, a smaller but dangerous rival in Florida's outlaw biker world. To understand how this rivalry turned deadly, we need to look at where the 69ers came from and how their rise set the stage for one of Florida's bloodiest. The rise of the 69ers. The 69ers Motorcycle Club was founded in Brooklyn, New York in the early 1960s. It began as a small East Coast riding group, but eventually grew into a one-percenter outlaw motorcycle club. The club built a reputation for being smaller than its rivals, but fiercely loyal and aggressive. They were often mentioned alongside larger and more established clubs like the Outlaws, Mongols, and Pagans. The 69ers wear a patch featuring a wolf, a symbol of strength, unity, and loyalty. On their website, the club cites a quote by Rudyard Kipling, "For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack." Like most outlaw motorcycle clubs, their patch includes the club's name on the top rocker, MC for Motorcycle Club, and the chapter's location on the bottom rocker. By the early 2000s, the 69ers had expanded from New York into Georgia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and finally, Florida. No one knew that moving to Florida would change everything. The state had long been considered Outlaws territory, and the 69ers' arrival was seen as a direct challenge. What started as small confrontations soon turned into planned ambushes and targeted attacks. Leading the charge in Florida was Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano, the intense and ambitious president of the Hillsborough chapter. His vice president, Sean Leonard, was his closest ally and handled much of the chapter's planning. Enforcing order was Eric Robinson, the sergeant-at-arms, responsible for discipline and carrying out the club's most violent work. Together, they turned the Florida chapter from a small local group into a serious threat to the Outlaws' control, sparking one of the bloodiest biker wars the state had ever seen. The Hillsborough chapter. The Hillsborough chapter was based in Hillsborough County, Florida, mainly around the Tampa area. It quickly became one of the 69ers Motorcycle Club's most active and unpredictable groups. While most of the club's older chapters operated in northern states, the Hillsborough group marked the 69ers' expansion into the Deep South. Led by Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano, the chapter earned a reputation for being reckless, confrontational, and fiercely protective of its turf. Their ambitions reached beyond Hillsborough County. They wanted to push into nearby areas like Pasco and Pinellas counties, regions that had long been under the control of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. This was not just a territorial dispute. In the world of outlaw bikers, moving into another club's area without permission is viewed as a direct challenge. The Outlaws had dominated Florida for decades, and the sight of 69ers patches on local roads was taken as open defiance. As the Hillsborough chapter grew in both size and influence, tensions between the two clubs continued to build. Fights broke out at bars, bike rallies, and public events. Each side wanted to prove its dominance, and the 69ers' aggressive rise from Tampa was pushing the state toward all-out war. That growing tension would soon erupt into the violence that defined one of Florida's most dangerous biker rivalries. To understand what the 69ers were up against, you have to look at the club that ruled Florida long before they arrived. The rivals, the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, was founded in 1935 in Illinois and had long considered Florida its home turf. By the 1960s, they had built a strong network across the state, controlling major cities and highways. For decades, no other motorcycle club dared to openly challenge their authority. To the Outlaws, Florida was more than just territory. It was part of their identity, a symbol of their power and dominance in the biker world. Any rival club trying to move in was seen as a threat that needed to be crushed. So when the 69ers began setting up chapters in Florida, recruiting new members, and riding openly in areas once loyal to the Outlaws. It was taken as a serious provocation. Every new clubhouse and every public ride by the 69ers was viewed as a challenge. Tensions started building quickly. What began as stares and verbal threats at biker rallies and bars soon turned into violent confrontations. Members from both clubs began showing up to events armed and ready for conflict. The roads around Tampa, Pasco, and Pinellas counties became dangerous ground. By the mid-2010s, both clubs knew a turf war was inevitable. The only question left was when it would start and who would make the first move. The fight on April 18, 2017. Tensions finally reached their peak during a crowded bike night at the local brewing company in Palm Harbor. Two members of the 69ers attended the event casually, unaware that their presence had already drawn dangerous attention. Before long, several outlaws at the bar noticed them and made it clear they weren't welcome on their territory. The confrontation began with words but quickly turned physical. Within moments, the outlaws surrounded the two men and attacked. The two 69ers were beaten to the ground by a group of about a dozen outlaws. The violence didn't stop there. Once the men were down, the outlaws tore off their vests, an act seen in biker culture as one of the deepest insults, a public stripping of identity and respect. For the 69ers, that night was more than a beating. It was a declaration of war. The message from the outlaws was clear. They still controlled Florida, but for the Killsborough chapter, led by Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano, the humiliation at Palm Harbor could not go unanswered. Cosimano swore revenge. He vowed to kill two outlaws and take their vests to restore the honor his club had lost. What followed would turn a simmering rivalry into one of the most violent biker wars Florida had ever seen. The aftermath of the fight. After the brutal Palm Harbor beating, the 69ers Killsborough chapter began planning revenge. Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano, humiliated by what had happened to his club brothers, made a promise to strike back. He swore that he would kill two outlaws and take their vests to restore the respect the 69ers had lost that night. Inside the club, his vow became a mission. Across Florida, Cosimano and his crew began preparing for what came next. They weren't planning another bar fight or a public show of force. This time, they were organizing a calculated hit, one that would send a message to every biker in the state. They wanted Florida and the entire outlaw motorcycle world to remember the name Killsborough. The first attack on the Outlaws months after the Palm Harbor beating, the 69ers set their sights on James "Jimbo" Costa, President St. Petersburg, chapter of Outlaws Motorcycle Club. Costa was well known in Florida's biker world. He was respected, connected, and believed to have approved the earlier attack on the 69ers. Taking him down would prove that the Killsborough chapter was ready to strike back. One afternoon, as Costa rode his motorcycle across the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, the 69ers made their move. They had planned the ambush carefully, waiting for the perfect moment to catch him alone and far from help. As Costa rode along the bridge, the attackers pulled up beside him and opened fire.
James Costa is a retired Hillsborough County firefighter and known chapter president of the Outlaws motorcycle gang. He was riding on his bike down 41 here when he was shot.
Costa reacted instantly. He swerved through traffic, accelerated, and escaped. The attempt failed, but the message was clear. The conflict between the two clubs had crossed the line. There was no turning back. From that day forward, both sides knew the feud was no longer about territory or pride. It was war, and the next encounter would not end with a warning. Weeks later, the violence reached a new level. Late one night in St. Petersburg, the Outlaws clubhouse, their longtime base of operations and a symbol of their power on the Gulf Coast, went up in flames. The fire spread quickly, and by the time firefighters arrived, the building was nearly destroyed. To outsiders, it may have seemed like an accident, but inside the biker world, no one had any doubts. It was payback. Investigators later ruled the fire suspicious and quietly suspected the 69ers were responsible. No one was arrested, and no one came forward. The Outlaws responded immediately. They reinforced their chapters, called in members from nearby states, and began watching every move the 69ers made. Tension spread through every chapter and every highway in Central Florida, but no one knew that the next attack would be personal, and its target was already being watched. The killing of Paul Anderson. On December 21, 2017, traffic slowed along the off-ramp of the Suncoast Parkway onto Highway 54 in Odessa, Florida. Among the vehicles waiting at the light sat Paul Quincy Anderson, president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club's Cross Bayou chapter. He had no idea he was being hunted. Two men on motorcycles pulled up beside Anderson's truck. Both bikes were black, their license plates flipped, and the riders' faces covered. The men were Christopher Dirty Cosimano, president of the 69ers Killsborough chapter, and Michael Pumpkin Mencher, another senior member. A third 69er, Alan B.B. Guinto, waited nearby in a car, acting as lookout. Cosimano and Mencher had been following Anderson since he left a nearby gym, tracking his movements through midday traffic. When Anderson came to a stop, Cosimano got off his bike, walked up to the truck, and tapped twice on the window before opening fire. Multiple rounds tore through the glass, killing Anderson instantly. He slumped over the wheel as the shooters sped away into the traffic on the Suncoast Parkway. It was a calculated execution, carried out in broad daylight on a busy road. For the 69ers, it was meant to send a message: revenge for the Palm Harbor beating, and proof that the Killsborough chapter would not be disrespected. Even the sheriff resembled it, as bad thing happened to bad people.
Sometimes bad things happen to bad people.
But the murder didn't strengthen their position. It brought everything crashing down. Within 12 hours, Pasco County Sheriff Chris Nacco announced 3 arrests. Cosimano, Mencher, and Guinto were all taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder.
In less than 24 hours, the Pasco Sheriff's Office, along with ATF and numerous law enforcement partners, including the Department of Transportation, were able to apprehend these 3 suspects in this crime.
Investigators said Mencher had been positioned as the finisher, ready to shoot if Cosimano failed, while Guinto acted as lookout from a nearby vehicle.
The other suspect did not fire any shots. His job was to finish the victim had the first shooter not killed him.
Sheriff Nacco credited the swift teamwork between his office, the ATF, and local law enforcement for bringing the suspects in so quickly. He also warned that more violence could follow, saying, "I hope and pray that there's not, but I believe there will be." The killing of Paul Anderson did not end the feud. It marked its peak, the moment the 69ers' war against the Outlaws spiraled beyond their control and led to their collapse in Florida. The funeral of Paul Anderson, days after Paul Anderson's murder. Hundreds of bikers from across Florida and neighboring states rode in formation to pay their respects. More than 1,000 motorcycles lined the streets outside the church, their engines rumbling in unison as a final tribute to the slain president of the Outlaws Cross Bayou chapter. Law enforcement was everywhere. Deputies, state troopers, and federal agents monitored the event closely, aware that members of rival clubs might appear or that tensions could flare. Patrol cars lined nearby roads, and a police helicopter circled overhead throughout the service. Despite the heavy security, the funeral remained solemn. Outlaws members, dressed in black leather vests bearing Anderson's patch, stood in silence as his casket was carried out. For them, Anderson wasn't just a leader. He was a symbol of loyalty and pride. The turnout sent a message of its own. The Outlaws had lost a president, but their unity was stronger than ever. And as the engines roared in farewell, it was clear the war between the Outlaws and the 69ers was far from over. The investigation. The investigation that followed Paul Anderson's murder quickly became one of the largest biker-related cases Florida had seen in years. Within hours, local deputies, state investigators, and federal agents from the ATF and FBI joined forces to identify and capture those responsible. Detectives gathered surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras near the scene. The videos showed the 2 motorcycles involved, giving investigators their first clear leads. Using that footage, along with vehicle descriptions and timing data, they began tracing the suspects back to the Killsborough chapter of the 69ers Motorcycle Club. Cell phone analysis later confirmed that Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano and Michael "Pumpkin" Mencher were in the area of the murder at the exact time it occurred. Their movements matched the path Anderson had taken, strengthening the case against them. What started as a local homicide investigation quickly turned into a multi-agency probe into Florida's outlaw biker world. A violent rivalry that had finally erupted into murder. The informant inside. As investigators closed in on the Killsborough chapter, one unexpected twist changed the entire case. A member of the 69ers turned informant. Under growing pressure, Sean Phelps Leonard quietly agreed to cooperate with federal agents. His decision gave investigators something they had never had before: an inside view of the club's inner workings, from how orders were given to how the hit on Paul Anderson was planned. The day after the murder, Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano and Michael "Pumpkin" Mencher called Leonard, looking for help and reassurance. "This is not a good situation, brother," Mencher told him over the phone. What they didn't know was that Leonard was already working with federal agents and was secretly recording every word. Through those recordings and later testimony, Leonard exposed the club's leadership structure, their secret meetings, and coded messages. He confirmed that Cosimano had personally vowed revenge after the Palm Harbor beating and had taken charge of planning Anderson's murder. He also described how Mencher and others helped follow Anderson in the days leading up to the ambush. When the case went to trial, prosecutors played those recordings for the jury. Leonard took the stand, sitting only a few feet away from his former brothers, and described how the assassination was planned and carried out step by step. His testimony, combined with surveillance footage, phone data, and ballistics, gave prosecutors the final evidence they needed. That single act of betrayal sealed the fate of the 69ers' Florida leadership. Their own members' words became the final blow, ensuring that the chapter's most powerful men would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Convictions and aftermath. In 2019, after a lengthy federal trial in Tampa, Christopher "Dirty" Cosimano, 31, and Michael "Pumpkin" Mencher, 52, were found guilty of murder in aid of racketeering, along with several related firearm and conspiracy charges. Both men were sentenced to life in federal prison. According to court records, prosecutors proved that Cosimano and Mencher, members of the 69ers Motorcycle Club, tracked and fatally shot Paul Anderson, president of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club's Cross Bayou chapter, as he sat in his truck at the State Road 54 exit off the Suncoast Parkway. The killing was the peak of a violent feud between the two rival motorcycle gangs that had spread across Florida. 3 additional 69ers members later pleaded guilty for their roles in the attack, admitting to aiding the planning and execution of the hit. Their cooperation helped confirm the details of the ambush and the broader retaliation plan that led to Anderson's death. The verdicts marked the end of one of Florida's most violent outlaw biker wars. The Killsborough chapter, once the 69ers' most feared and aggressive faction, was dismantled. Many of its members were imprisoned or disappeared from the biker scene entirely. What began as a quest for revenge after a public beating ended in a federal courtroom, with the club's leaders condemned to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. For the Outlaws, the death of Paul Anderson became both a tragedy and a rallying point. The club reclaimed its dominance across Florida, re-establishing control over territories once challenged by the 69ers. For law enforcement, the case stood as a rare victory in the long history of biker gang violence. Years of surveillance, informant cooperation, and interagency work had exposed a world driven by loyalty, revenge, and power, and showed how far both sides were willing to go to protect their name. The fall of the 69ers in Florida. The murder of Paul Anderson was meant to prove that the 69ers could stand toe-to-toe with the Outlaws. Instead, it destroyed them. Within months of the arrests, the Killsborough chapter, the club's most aggressive and influential faction, collapsed. Its leadership was behind bars. Its members either fled the state or quietly left the biker scene altogether. In 2020, the 69ers' presence in Florida had vanished. Their clubhouses were abandoned, their colors disappeared from the highways, and their influence faded overnight. What had once been a rising force in the state's biker underworld was reduced to scattered remnants with no power, no structure, and no voice. The Outlaws reclaimed their dominance without firing another shot. The 69ers, once feared for their ambition and violence, became a cautionary tale in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. A reminder of what happens when a small club takes on an empire. The war that began with pride ended in silence. The 69ers had killed an outlaw boss, but in doing so, they lost everything. The 69ers proved they could take down an outlaw boss, but in doing so, they destroyed themselves. Click on the next video to see how it all came crashing down.